All right, you're going to be taking some notes on cellular respiration, and there are going to be some quiz questions throughout. So you can pause the video at any time to write down what you need to write down. Make sure you take those quiz questions to check that you're understanding everything as we go. So our notes are cellular respiration notes. The essential question is explain how and why cells use the energy in glucose to make ATP. So we are going to be focusing on the energy in glucose and how it's getting used to make this thing called ATP. So we're going to be focusing on that. Pause the video now if you need to finish writing down the title and the essential question. So glucose contains tons of energy. Remember, plants store up the sun's energy in glucose during photosynthesis. And so now we're talking about how does that energy get back out so that a cell can use it. There is so much energy in glucose that a cell would literally explode. It would light on fire if the energy got released all at once. So cellular respiration releases that energy from glucose slowly so that your body does not light on fire. Because I want you to keep remembering that cellular respiration is a lot like burning. You're literally burning the food. That's why we breathe in oxygen, to burn the glucose. But the weird thing is that even though cells need energy to do things, and glucose has energy in it, a cell cannot run straight on glucose, just like a flashlight can't run on gasoline. That would be really weird if you tried to put gasoline into a flashlight. So kind of like how if you had a battery factory, you could burn fuels and use that energy to charge batteries, your cells do something similar because glucose is a fuel. So your cells can burn fuels, but they're not using that burning directly. They actually use the energy to charge up something that's like a battery, and then that can get used to do things in your cells. So the name of the battery-like thing that your cells use is ATP. This is a very important word. Make sure you write this down in your notes. If you want to know what it stands for adenosine triphosphate, but you don't need to memorize that if you don't want to. ATP is what we call it. ATP is just the form of chemical energy that cells use to perform all their jobs. It's kind of like a rechargeable battery. So your cells can charge up ATP using the energy from glucose, and then they use it to do stuff like your muscle cells use loads of ATP. Every time you move your muscle cells, if you move around right now, you can think about how your cells are using ATP, and when that ATP gets drained, it can get recharged. This is kind of what it looks like. If you want to know a little bit about its structure, you do not need to know this. You can just think about it like a rechargeable battery, and that is good enough for this class, that we're thinking about ATP being like a rechargeable battery in your cells. So cellular respiration is what we call it when cells burn glucose to release the energy. Cellular respiration takes the energy from the glucose and stores it in ATP. So glucose has chemical energy in it. We know energy can take lots of forms: light, heat, motion. Chemical energy is really important in biology. In between the bonds of this glucose, there's loads of energy stored, just waiting to get released. And so when it gets released, it gets stored up as chemical energy again in ATP, which is just something else, another molecule that can hold that energy. And then that energy from the ATP can get used to help you grow. Your muscles use it for moving. And anything that your body does that requires energy, or anything a plant's body does that requires energy, uses ATP. So this can help us to understand that cellular respiration is done by both plants and animals, because even though plants make glucose, they still have to burn that glucose and get the energy into ATP before they can do anything like growing or anything else that happens in their body that requires energy. So let's tie this back to what we learned about burning. We talked about how burning takes fuel and oxygen. So glucose is kind of like the fuel, right? Like when we burned the candle, the wax was the fuel. Glucose is a fuel, and oxygen is needed in order to burn that fuel. It reacts really strongly with the glucose. We get oxygen by breathing it in. So we breathe in oxygen, and that reacts with the fuel that we have. Plants can get oxygen by breathing in through their leaves. Other organisms have different ways of getting it. Some organisms can even get oxygen across their skin. Like frogs actually can breathe oxygen across their skin. fish breathe oxygen across their gills, but whenever an organism's breathing, it's taking in oxygen to help it burn this fuel from glucose. So the other thing that has to come into this process of cellular respiration is the uncharged battery, the drained battery, because cellular respiration is about recharging this ATP. When it's uncharged, we call it ADP. Don't worry too much about that. I just want you to know that we have this uncharged battery coming in that's going to get recharged by the process of burning the glucose with oxygen. Once the oxygen reacts with the glucose, the outputs are carbon dioxide and water, because burning releases carbon dioxide and water. So that's where all the atoms from the glucose and oxygen went. The glucose becomes carbon dioxide. The hydrogen atoms here end up in the water. So this process just turns the fuel, it turns the glucose into carbon dioxide and water by using that oxygen. The energy is being transferred here. The energy goes from the glucose into the ATP, but the atoms from the glucose and the oxygen become carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so I'm going to label that. The matter is blue, so we can see the atoms from glucose, the atoms from oxygen becoming CO2 and water. The energy is going to be green. Energy is going from glucose into ATP. So just to recap what happens in cellular respiration, glucose gets taken apart, well, bam, explode the glucose, burn the glucose. The energy gets put into ATP, and the atoms, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are released as waste. And we talked about how those in an animal get breathed out. So when you burn your food or you burn fat, all the atoms ultimately get breathed out, and the energy gets transferred into ATP so that it can be used by the cells and by the body. It turns out that actually only some of the energy in glucose, actually only 38% of the energy is put into ATP, which is kind of crazy. Most of it gets released as heat. So here's just a picture of an elephant, and you can see how much heat the elephant is giving off. That is from respiration. If you feel your own body, the energy you feel, that heat energy, is just being given off from fuel. But heat is not useful energy. Your body cannot use heat. So this 38% that gets stored in ATP, that's the useful energy that your cells can get from glucose. One thing that's kind of crazy to think about, and that some of you may have noticed, is that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are actually opposite of each other. So look at this. Photosynthesis makes glucose and oxygen, right? Cellular respiration takes in glucose and oxygen and makes CO2 and water. Photosynthesis takes in CO2 and water and makes glucose and oxygen. So it kind of cycles like this. This is not an accident. This is because these processes are kind of opposite. Photosynthesis uses energy to make fuel. Cellular respiration burns that fuel to carbon dioxide and releases the energy. So when cellular respiration happens, carbon dioxide gets returned to the atmosphere and it can be used again for photosynthesis. This is really important in ecosystems because photosynthesis and cellular respiration are recycling the matter in the ecosystems, matter being atoms and molecules. Specifically, they are really important for recycling carbon because carbon is in glucose and carbon is in carbon dioxide. And so as glucose is made and then burned again, the carbon dioxide gets recycled. Our planet has a limited amount of carbon. Our planet will never get new carbon unless it comes from outer space. So carbon has to get recycled in order for ecosystems to continue to function. But we can see that the energy is not getting recycled. Energy flows through. It comes from the sun, gets stored in glucose, it gets released as ATP, and cells use that to do work. It gets released as heat, and so then that just gets lost to the environment, as we talked about when we learned about energy flow. And so through photosynthesis and cellular respiration, energy is flowing through ecosystems. So just to wrap up, we have learned about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is just like burning. It takes fuel, glucose, takes oxygen, just like a fire takes fuel and oxygen. Cellular respiration takes glucose and oxygen, and it turns those two things into CO2 and water, just like a fire releases CO2 and water. In that process, energy from glucose, there's loads of energy stored in the glucose, it gets stored up in ATP. And then once you have ATP, you can do anything. So that is everything you need to know about cellular respiration. If you need to go back and watch another part of the video, you can. Otherwise, if your notes are done and you feel good, you're ready to move on to the next activity.